Hello, my name is Paula DeFranco, and welcome to Journey into Mind as Machine. For the next half hour, I will be describing and introducing you to a theory that makes a radical departure from current cognitive psychological models. Our objectives for today are threefold. First, I will introduce you to the transaction model, and I will demonstrate how triggers is the first responder in human behavior and learning. Secondly, I will briefly introduce you to the interdisciplinary lens anchoring the research in this meta framework. And finally, we will look at the clinical applications and areas of potential future research. So what is a transaction model? It is three circles: interrelated, dynamic, random, yet organized. This new cognitive behavior model draws upon and combines complementary elements from the relevant and pioneering research of Thalen and Smith on nonlinear dynamic systems, and by expanding on Jung's basic two-step framework of the psyche, or specifically expanding on the term ego with the new term triggers. The interdependency and interaction between the patterns resulting from the components emerge from a few simple rules and form the basic rules of the model. The transaction model's dynamic, circular, and interconnected framework also addresses the concepts of self-organization and complexity. It does this by demonstrating how patterns of behavior arise from the interaction between the three components of the model, together operating as an information processing unit. The transaction model is a multi-layered assessment, intervention, and relational tool, organizing data in a unique and interactive dynamic format. The generalizability of the model enhances the buffet of current behavioral assessment tools and can be utilized by clinicians, researchers, educators, leaders, and organizations. These are the three main components of the model. Triggers is the independent variable, and the monitoring mechanism consists of two components, which are unbiased processing and self-reflection. So then, how does this information processing system work? Well, the system is a collection of three components with significant interactions, although not necessarily synergistic. There are well-defined boundaries separating the system from the environment, such as is illustrated here, where the behavior system is separate from the external environment. The transaction model rejects the concept of nature versus nurture and instead shows how nature and nurture work in harmony together to demonstrate behavior. The epistemology is based on the assumption that behavior is disorderly and chaotic, yet dynamic, organized, and adhering to certain rules. So let's look at the first component of triggers. What are triggers? A trigger is something that sets off a memory tape or a flashback, an association transporting the person back to the event of the original trauma. Triggers are also very personal. Different things trigger different people. And this is key and relevant because it is the component of triggers and its substratas that create a unique individual blueprint of behavior. The senses identified as most common to trigger someone are sight and sound, followed by touch and smell, and taste close behind. A combination of the senses is identified, especially in situations that strongly resemble the original trauma. So why is it important to know your triggers? The assumption is that your triggers govern and constrain the interaction of the other two variables in the model. And although an enormous range of patterns are theoretically possible, the system settles into preferred patterns of behavior demonstrated as personality. The drop-down clusters within triggers creates a blueprint then that is unique to each individual and mimicking human behavior. So let's see what that looks like. And there's the blueprint. This diagram is a very clear indication of how triggers, seemingly a very simple component, becomes very complex and adaptive in the system. Now, the network structure of the variables also show the overlay between variables that may or may not be present. What's interesting is that when an event comes in from the lived experience and activates what I call the doorbell, and this doorbell in human behavior can be activated from within the system of behavior, or it can be activated by the external world and a lived experience. Now, assuming the event comes from the external world, it rings the doorbell and it activates triggers. And then the subclusters automatically organize, and whatever it is that constitutes this individual's triggers will create a new subsystem consisting of the influence from the outside environment and a compilation of these substratas. That is your new subsystem. What happens then? Well, then the monitoring mechanism comes into play. And that is really the brains of the model. A nonlinear approach, because the linear approach to human behavior has not been working out so well for us. The brains of the transaction model is the monitoring mechanism. It is underpinned by the research of Nichols and Stitch, two researchers out of Canada who introduced the concept of the monitoring mechanism as another component or cluster of basic cognitive architecture. According to the authors, this mechanism would serve the function of monitoring one's own mental states. And that's exactly what the monitoring mechanism does in relation and in interaction with triggers. So what is the monitoring mechanism? There are two basic components which together comprise and define the monitoring mechanism. And that is unbiased processing and self-reflection. The two components were extracted from the authentic leadership research and authenticity theory, and specifically the work of Kernes and Goldman, whose research focused on operationalizing the concept or construct of authenticity and based on confirmatory factor analysis results. Now, unbiased processing is defined as the objectivity of self-relevant information. Also, unbiased processing involves a lack of distortion and exaggerating and evaluating external information. According to Kernes and Goldman, a major benefit of unbiased processing is the ongoing contribution to an accurate sense of self. And this topic of self is critical when we refer to Jung's basic model of the psyche. Now, self-reflection, on the other hand, is defined by Morin as a self-evaluation process that itself is dependent on self-awareness. The assumption in this meta-framework is that the construct of self-reflection is interchangeable with the term self-evaluation or insight. It is further postulated that this insight is critical to synthesizing, evaluating, and engaging in cognitive processes. So now, let's venture over to our second objective, the theory and research underpinning the transaction model. We begin with Carl Jung's framework of the psyche. In Carl Jung's model, the psyche is emphasized as the personal unconscious or ego, resting upon a deeper layer defined as the collective unconscious or shadow. These two universal human traits, he asserted, described the self. The framework's two circles acting as a two-part mechanism where ego is displayed in the outer world and interacting with external matter. The shadow, on the other hand, is part of the collective unconscious. Jacobi and Bash cite that Jung's structure of the psychic as dynamic and non-static. And just as the building up and tearing down of cells keeps the physical organism in equilibrium, so, as a rough comparison, the distribution of psychic energy determines the relationship between the various psychic data. And what that means is the interaction between these two is determined by the effect or the influence of the external event from the environment. Furthermore, Jung saw the psyche and the self as a self-regulating system. In self-regulation, the concept of appraisal is an unconscious process by which experiences are constantly screened and evaluated to determine their meaning and significance. Another component of self-regulation is its sensitivity and dependence on the external environment. The pioneering research of Sanders in 2002 asserted that each living system, each organism, is seen as self-organizing, self-regulating, and self-correcting within its surrounding and its environment. This concept is also very similar to Jung's assertion that the psyche is a self-organizing system and self-regulating. Jung envisioned this as a complex, interconnected system that included many subsystems, such as the subclusters within triggers, in communication. In this total system of the psyche, the quantity of energy is constant, and only its distribution is variable. Now, dynamics are not something new within our frameworks. We see dynamics within many different structures within society. Some examples of dynamic systems include biology, weather systems, and, although broken, the U.S. tax system. So, what are some of the characteristics of a dynamic system? Well, it is a self-organizing system that accommodates behavior that is random, complex, and chaotic. The organization and structure of the system are also the result of free, nonlinear, and time-dependent interactions. It is a system bringing mind and body into dialogue. It is an open system where the three components are free to interact with each other in soft assembly. What that means is that the brain is no longer the controller of behavior. And in this view of cognition, now the brain and the body are in continuous dialogue. So then, The focus is not on what changes, but rather how these changes in behavior occur. And now we move into dynamic systems. And this is the big discovery in this meta theory, the discovery that is found within the phase space. So what is the phase space? This phase space is the overlap between the first two spheres where complexity arises out of the overlap. It is the place where mistakes are learning opportunities. In mathematics and physics, a phase space of a dynamical system is a space in which all possible states of a system are represented, with each possible state corresponding to one unique point in the phase space. Now that we've covered the basics on the model and the main players, how does the model work? What does it look like in action? Well, let's take a look. The first dimension, or circle, housing triggers, is responsible for system stability and continuity in our lives. As we already discussed, it is the doorbell. What this means is that external information or outside experiences introduced into the behavior system are folded into a new system. The new subsystem combines with the initial behavior system without destabilizing the system and moves through it to produce its respective outcomes as behavior. However, if the new system destabilizes the behavior system, then the system seeks to self-organize. And this results in two critical points the system can gear towards, which we will discuss later in more detail. However, whereas the first dimension seeks to preserve model stability, the second dimension is constantly challenging the status quo. This results in why we behave the way we do. There's rules of engagement underpinning the model and the behavior system. The organizational tenets that underlie this meta framework follow organizational principles as outlined by Thalen and Smith in the text A Dynamic Systems Approach to the Development of Cognition and Action. Triggers is the collective variable of interest. Triggers also captures the degrees of freedom in the model's design. Triggers, the collective variable of triggers and the subclusters is a relationship. The timing between a stimulus, which in this case would be the external events, and the response between subcomponents in the system. This relationship governs the process of how a pattern organizes from the interaction between the subcomponents. It also characterizes the behavioral attractor states, outlining the preferred states of the variable triggers, and at different points in time and over different conditions. The dynamical conditions underpinning the nonlinear framework of the transaction model give rise to the self-organization of behavior. And this is a critical distinction defining the meta framework of the transaction model from current psychological models rooted in linear properties. So how do the rules operationalize the behavior system? Well, let's take a look. This is a theoretical framework which provides an alternative to the dualism of current psychological models, which restrict the freedom to examine the roots of behavior in a random, yet organized behavior pattern. The transaction model proposes a new meaning for time and space through the integration of dynamic principles and resulting in a connection between theory and mathematical formulas. A topographical portrait of the model's meta-framework maps the collective variables demonstrated as behavior over time and in the appropriate state space, capturing the essential degrees of freedom. In turn, the state space right here is bounded by relevant system variables. The transaction model is an open system where the components are free to interact with one another. Thalen and Smith know that this freedom to relate in a non-linear capacity is capable of remarkable properties when sufficient energy is pumped into these systems. New ordered structures may spontaneously appear that were not formerly apparent. And that is the definition of a trigger. It wasn't formerly apparent because the subcluster had not been activated. The introduction of an external event into the behavior system suddenly patterns in space and regularities in time. Highly complex yet ordered patterns and shifting from one pattern to another. It is the introduction of the external event into the system that drives the behavior system out of equilibrium. As a result, certain configurations of the two components increase until a dominant mode activated by triggers dominates the behavior system. Triggers is also capable of slaving the other two components. The transaction model can be described as a behavior system with two order parameters. We have triggers and we have the monitoring mechanism. And both constrain and compress the degrees of freedom. The model's organizing meta-framework creates and annihilates patterns simultaneously and according to the behavior requirement of the system. The amplitude of triggers and the monitoring mechanism both play the role of an order parameter or control parameter as found in the Raleigh-Bernard system. Therefore, the subcomponents, including the influence of the external event, the activation of triggers and its substrates, create a bifurcation that result in a new and ordered coordinated pattern of behavior. The model intuitively demonstrates two independent critical points where contact making and contact breaking bifurcations are possible. At the contact making critical point in the model's design, the order parameter of the monitoring mechanism overpowers the order parameter triggers, resulting in the formation of an adaptive or new behavior in the model's efforts to self-organize through the process of adaptive transformation. However, at the contact breaking critical point, triggers annihilate and overpower the MM, reinforcing the negative behavior and demonstrated as the outcome. The math behind the model is quite simple, where triggers is equal to T and the monitoring mechanism is equal to learning, and the frequency is a time and space. Therefore, learning or the monitoring mechanism is developed based on the frequency of the triggers. The monitoring mechanism is also responsible for what we experience as the now. The minimum unit of interactions is the sum of all moments of the monitoring mechanism until the current moment. This is what shapes our belief system. This is not a philosophical or theoretical statement, but an inherent consequence of the components being quantified. The formula shows how life and death are an abstract construction of consciousness and learning. When triggers and the monitoring mechanism interact, immense energy is released proportional to their mass. From a quantum perspective, every instance of learning has an anti-learning. The behavior system then reaches a threshold, resulting in the adaptive transformation when learning is canceled out by its anti-learning, an indication that trigger has overpowered and been reinforced. Learning's interpretation of this single annihilating moment is framed with an abstract arrow of time. If we then want to define interaction and look at the basic properties of wave-particle quanta, all intersections in the phase space would consist of chaos random energy to explain the fundamental forces. Now, most neurological investigation shows that actions such as those housed in the first dimension of triggers occurs before the monitoring mechanism is activated. Therefore, triggers underpins cognitive dissonance and interference or resonance within the monitoring mechanism. The ability to understand and deconstruct triggers acquired through the lived experience confirms how important our belief system is in expanding consciousness and learning. The role of working memory is responsible to the extent in which connections are made between neural processes, resulting in a bifurcation and a subsystem in the first dimension. More importantly, it also explains how the behavior system is a network of subsystems instead of a linear sequence of mechanical algorithms. The transaction model is a meta framework incorporating the 4 principles of adult learning. Adults need to be involved. Adults need to understand what their triggers are. Adult experiences, specifically mistakes, provide a window where learning can occur. Adults learn from the lived experience. And adult learning is problem-centered. Let's identify our triggers. Let's start deconstructing our triggers. And in the process, we're strengthening and developing our monitoring mechanism. Now this diagram shows the interaction between 2 individuals with their blueprints completely mapped out. This can be me and my professor, me and the student, me with the cashier at the grocery store. But any interaction with another individual can now be mapped out, and we can see the complexity of relationships diagrammed in an interactive format. The transaction model is a multi-layered assessment, intervention, and relational tool that enhances the buffet of current CBT behavioral tools. The transaction model reveals the windows of possibilities for learning framed within systems theory. The window, a practical, universal human mechanism for learning that is both measurable and observable. The transaction model's format helps individuals find their words, but not only that, learn how to fit words into categories. And the model is an ongoing learning process uniquely dependent on the individual's own learning pace. The transaction model combines physics and takes the opportunity of mistakes to create learning in the phase space. Mind as machine is a new epistemology based on the assumption that nature and behavior is disorderly and chaotic. Keslow advanced this notion that the globality of thought emerges as a self-organized system of the nervous system, coupled, as it is, to the environment, and consciousness was unlikely to be sitting in any single place in the nervous system. By structuring behavior in a meta-framework as a processing system, the window where learning and development is now revealed. This then becomes a behavioral GPS. Because while knowing what to do is important, knowing what not to do is critical. The transaction model is 21st century self-directed learning. Assumptions underlying the transaction model include the individual and individual behavior as the unit of analysis. Another assumption is that individuals have a core behavioral structure consisting of the three components of the transaction model: triggers, self-reflection, and unbiased processing. And very important is that triggers, as the dominant mode, is capable of slaving the two elements comprising the monitoring mechanism. This meta-framework, the three components together are evidenced as the outcome termed individual human behavior. The transaction model complements current psychological perspectives, including psychoanalytical, transpersonal, humanistic, social cognitive, and trait, expanding the linearity of these models into non-linear form. Now, this is a fabulous diagram that I like to refer to. This first line over here demonstrates behavior without the mind as a machine concept. Below, we see the same three circles, but now we're applying the concept of mind as an information processing unit. This is an infant in both cases, this is an adolescent, and this last one here is an adult. Now, a couple of things stick out automatically. The first are the size of the circles. Because the model is not a static model, we are constantly evolving, growing, and learning. The model demonstrates this. The more we develop problem-solving skills, self-directed learning, the more we develop the monitoring mechanism and we deconstruct triggers. Now, as an example, let's take the adolescent. We all know adolescents going through a very big transition between the hormones and moving from childhood into young adulthood. And most of the times we see adolescents are very reactive, reacting to whatever triggers come from within the environment. And this is really oftentimes demonstrated as very explosive or vocal outcomes. But now let's take a look when we operationalize the three components in this adolescent who started this training and development of the monitoring mechanism from infancy. What's most striking is that the monitoring mechanism is quite large in relation to the triggers, whereas up here, the triggers is relatively larger than the monitoring mechanism. But this also indicates that the adolescent is no longer reacting to the external events, But they're stepping into this window of learning and having those aha moments registered by less hormonal induced behavioral outcomes, less reactive outcomes. This is the possibilities. This is the power of the transaction model and the ongoing development at the individual's pace. So where does the future take us? Well, we still need to identify and map the transition states within the model clinically. And the pilot studies using the model's framework against traditional therapeutic methods is also in order. And understanding the factors that contribute to an adult's readiness to change, or what factors might influence it. The transaction model is an ongoing assessment tool and framework for clinicians, educators, and researchers, providing a meta framework that can map the subsystem activated by the patient's trigger, demonstrated as a transition period, and indicating behavior as unstable. It is an interrelational, ongoing therapeutic assessment tool that develops and promotes critical thinking skills and problem-solving abilities. It is 21st century self-directed learning. Thank you for being here with me today. Please, any comments, questions, there's my email. Feel free to contact me. And you can find me on Facebook under the Transaction Model. Bye-bye.